Welcome, one and all to Impolite Company on the www.gcpr.live network, where we defy the old adage and dive headfirst into religion and politics. I'm your host, Matthew Best, here to walk with you in honest dialogue and showcase the power of seeing the humanity of people with different perspectives. You can send me your questions, comments to contactimpolitecompany@gmail.com. And you can find previous episodes, sign up to listen to new episodes through popular podcast channels like iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can find us on YouTube. Just look for the logo, Impolite Company, and you will find us very easily. And you can dive further into topics that we talk about on the show by going to my blog at pastormatthewbest.com. If you enjoy what we're doing here and you find value in it, you can please support the show by going to buymeacoffee.com/Impolite Company. Anything that is contributed gets turned right back into the show. Before we dive into today's episode, I always like to take a little moment of personal privilege to highlight a couple things that I support, and I hope that you might as well. You can show some love to Christ Lutheran Church in Harrisburg. It's the congregation that I serve as pastor. Christ Lutheran Church is a special place and community of healing. And what makes this church unique is that we host 3 free health clinics that have helped over 100,000 people since 2018. And so you can go to christharrisburg.org/donate. Second thing is, if you care about homelessness, this is coming up. You can check out the Memorial Blanket Project. Each year, people make blankets for strangers, and we make an art installation to highlight homelessness and give them away at the end of the night. We've done this in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. We've done this on the front lawn of the U.S. Capitol. Last year was on the Pennsylvania Capitol. This year, we're going to be in front of the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. So you can go to memorialblanket.org. And lastly, if you're looking for a tool to help with conversations on the difficult topic of gun violence while seeing the humanity of others, you can check out American Roulette. It's a unique novel which highlights the humanity of the victims, the community, and even the perpetrator, while offering no solutions, just conversation. All the proceeds of the book go to organizations that address gun violence. And all those links will be at the bottom of the YouTube channel. Today, I am really excited. This is the first time I've done a panel of guests, and this is our pre-election episode. So I'm going to introduce each of our guests. And our first guest is Amy Carr, and she is a professor of religious studies at Western Illinois University. She also leads adult education at Trinity Lutheran Church in Macomb, and has recently fostered ecumenical conversations about civic life and faith. She studied at Carleton College, Vanderbilt Divinity School, and the University of Chicago. And she's currently working on a book for a Cascade series on Lutheran reconstructions of doctrine called Facing Divine Affliction, a Lutheran theodicy for the sinned against. Amy grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you.
And we also have Christine Helmer, who holds the Peter B. Ritzma Professor of Chair of Humanities at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where she is the Professor of German and Religious Studies. She was awarded an honorary doctorate in 2017 from the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki. We'll talk about that because I took classes. I did a year of studies in Finland, so I was excited to see that, by the way. Dr. Helmer is a internationally renowned scholar of Martin Luther, specifically the relation of Luther's theology to medieval philosophy. Friedrich Schleiermacher, particularly his exegetical theology and the role of dialectics in his theology, the early 20th century Luther Renaissance, and historical constructive theology. Dr. Helmer has published numerous articles and book chapters on topics of her research interest, and she is the author of 5 books, including the co-authored work with our other guest, Amy, Ordinary Faith in Polarized Times, and co-edited and has edited 13 volumes. She's an instructor of a free online course, which she just told me about before going live, which is Luther in the West. It's on Corsa.org. and she's completing a book in constructive theology, explorations of self, world, self, and God, and is co-editing a volume on Schleiermacher and democracy. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you for organizing this.
Yeah, absolutely. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Adam Kradel, who is an Episcopal priest and has been for 25 years. And early in his ministry, he took a leave from parish leadership to earn a PhD in American politics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His dissertation explored the U.S. presidents of the post-World War II era use of religious language in their speeches and audiences' reaction to that language. He was surprised at the reemergence of Christian nationalism in American politics during the 2016 presidential campaign, but once that change happened, he was able to interpret how it happened and perhaps have an idea of how it can fade away. And he serves at St. John Episcopal in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is where I live also, is in Carlisle. So Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And it's I was in graduate school the last time I was in this Midwestern group, so this is fun.
That's great. That's great. Awesome. Well, I wanted to get us started. I have a question to get us started. And again, this is, as I had said before we got started, it's one of those, I'm going to throw the question out, and whoever feels like jumping in first, you get the opportunity to do that. So maybe just very shortly, what is your own experience with politics and faith? And I'm not talking about it on a professional level. I'm talking about it in a more personal interaction. How have the two informed each other and shaped your ministry as you've gone forward? Who wants to tackle that first?
Well, see, because I'm still in my work clothes, I can say that I'm a devout Christian, and so therefore the entirety of my worldview is formed by that. And so the entirety of what I think my community should strive for is based by my understanding of what Jesus wants. And so that's certainly, and by no means, I mean, I actually am German. My last name's Kradel, and I live in the middle of Pennsylvania. There's a lot of us, but I'm not a German pietist that separates faith and public life. And I don't think the German pietists did Christianity any good by doing that. So therefore, what I want in politics is what I think Jesus wants. Now, I'm deeply aware that I don't know precisely what Jesus wants, but I have some ideas of what Jesus doesn't want. So,
yeah. Okay, great. Amy or Christine?
I could say that I was shaped thinking about faith and politics explicitly, probably in college at Carleton, working with the college chaplain, who's actually in the Progressive National Baptist tradition. And within my first week of working with her as a chaplain's associate, had me co-organizing Martin Luther King celebrations. So I was very shaped by her and her way of kind of mixing the prophetic and the mystical. And then I was in the Lutheran Volunteer Corps for a year. So I spent a year living in an intentional community with other volunteers and working for the Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Central America. So I met a lot of people in that context who combine their faith with activism around human rights, and that has certainly shaped me a lot. And then it kind of continues from there. So I think a blend of sort of faith-based activism, but also always trying to seek conversation with people who disagree, or trying to be in a worship space that always holds a sense of the kingdom of God, or kingdom of God that's larger than any project we're investing in.
And I wanted just let everybody know that I'm a theologian and an academic theologian, which means that I tend to look at ideas from through the experience of thinking about them, rather than what you were talking about, Adam, or Amy, about an existential kind of relationship, existential work in the political field. I became very interested in politics, studying the history of Germany, particularly the history of Germany from 1910 to 1950, and my sort of the intellectual pursuit of looking at politics and Bonhoeffer's Bonhoeffer's claim that the theologians of the day in Nazi Germany had not paid sufficient theoretical attention to the relationship between theology and politics was to their detriment. The theologians realized, or many theologians realized, too late the danger that Hitler had posed. I would also like to tell you about another anecdote from another theologian, Eberhard Jungel, who was a professor of theology in Tübingen. And I remember distinctly a lecture in which he said that theology had nothing to do with ethics or politics. And I think
Wow.
that is one of the kind of one strand of Lutheran theology that I trace in some of my work, a strand in Lutheran theology that looks at justification, the doctrine of justification, in absolute distinction to sanctification or works that are being motivated by faith. And this is one trajectory in Lutheran theology that Bonhoeffer criticized. And I think that it is important for Lutherans to understand this legacy that theology has nothing to do with ethics, and begin to reconstitute that, try to figure out how justification and justice go together with the and justification and justice that Amy and I wrote about in our book on justification and the pursuit of justice.
Yeah, and just to be fair, because I know Amy's gonna, I need to answer my own question, right? And so my own experience is before being a pastor, and this is going back, I worked in the world of politics. I worked in Washington. I graduated with a degree in political science, and then went to work for a member of Congress in Washington, D.C. I was there during the Clinton impeachment time. Worked for a moderate Republican who was one of 8 who only voted for one article of impeachment, because he could not vote for none, because otherwise he would be out of a job. So it was an interesting experience. I've worked on campaigns. I've worked on all sorts of doing advocacy, all sorts of things. And to me, politics is a form of stewardship in a way, and so kind of discipleship in a way. But it's really important to know that faith is the grounding first that drives me to do anything that I've done, or at least that's the way it's supposed to be. So not always perfect, right? So I want to ask you, we're going to start with a little bit of looking backwards. And as I have mentioned, we're not going to put you all on the spot and say, what do you think is going to happen? No one has any idea, right? But I want to look back, because this is a show about having healthy conversations about religion and politics. And so I want to ask you, what has stood out to you during this election cycle compared to previous ones, especially in comparison to talk around faith and politics, either harmful or healthy? What has stood out to you about that?
Well, I'd like to begin by talking about what I see to be, I think, one of the top 5 words that we can use to describe the contemporary landscape, that I think is maybe even a little wider than just sort of election focused. I work at a university, and I know you work in churches. I think there's a broader problem in our society, and that I would summarize as the closure of discourse. That different places are managing discourse. My husband, Robert Orsi, has used the term the managed speech at the university. There's a speech management that identifies what one can't talk about, what one can talk about. There are many questions on our contemporary landscape that are being foreclosed, and one isn't allowed to ask certain questions. And so I think the cultural moment is one of closing and foreclosing conversation, closing and foreclosing the asking of questions that one might really want to ask. And I think that this foreclosing asking intelligent questions about all sorts of issues, from the relationship between faith and politics to topics such as capital punishment, the death penalty, climate change. We're in a moment in which I think theologians, leaders are being invited to open up conversations such as the sort you are doing on this show. I'm really grateful that you have provided a space for opening up a forum for polite or impolite and healing conversations.
Right. Yeah. Impolite only because, the old adage of you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics in impolite company. Well, that served us so well, hasn't it? kind of going to what Adam, you were talking about before, the kind of the, not the pietistic, that hasn't served us. I really love that statement of closure of discourse in there. Yeah, Amy, Adam, either one of you want to add?
Oh, go ahead. I'll go.
Remind me again, the question was what have surprised us, or?
Yeah, what stood out to you so far in this election cycle compared to previous ones about especially in comparison to discussions around faith and politics?
Sure. So pre-2016, so my dissertation I finished in 2008. I looked at the religious rhetoric used by American presidents from Truman up through George W. Bush's first term. And then I did a number of things. But one thing I did is looked at the norms for political discourse for elite politicians. And by the way, why I started with Truman is he's the first person to give a nationally televised address.
Okay.
And so then I just used all their national addresses. And norms definitely shifted over time from 1945 to 2008. In 1945 through the 50s, you would have seen a lot of what sociologists call civil religion. Eisenhower gave me the best sentence for that one. He said, "I don't care what kind of religion a man is, but he should have one." And he said man too, because it was the 50s.
Sure.
But the idea was a vague theism that united people. That definitely over time got replaced with pluralism. And pluralism is essentially recognizing the religious diversity of the audience out there. The first person when they were mentioning, and these are all American presidents, when you were mentioning houses of worship to mention synagogue was Bill Clinton. So it took a while.
Yeah.
Then George W. Bush brought in a mosque when he was talking about houses of worship. And then with Obama, I figured the pattern would be the Abrahamic religion, something like churches, synagogues, mosques, and then probably one other. And Obama did that. And I think it was in his inaugural address, but that was past my dissertation. So,
Sure.
But then, so I was surprised to see religious nationalism make a resurgence in a way that you hadn't seen at a national level since the beginning of the fundamentalist era. And I think how that happened is best described in a book that was published way before 2016 ever happened. It was a book called The Great Divide by Jeffrey Lehman.
Oh, yeah.
And how it's a thick social science book, but essentially, if you were a conservative Christian in 1974, you wouldn't be sure which political party would be your party. And political entrepreneurs within the Republican Party recognized this and started to try and make the Republican Party the party of conservative Christianity. Now, even in 2000, so this is Al Gore versus George W. Bush, Al Gore lost evangelicals as a group by 2 points to George W. Bush in 2000. It was more in 2004. But I think where during the 2016 Trump campaign, he realized that if he used Christian nationalism in a certain amount of his rhetoric, he could probably mobilize people that hadn't been voting. Now, I can tell you that there's only so many people that do religion and politics in the United States, and I haven't done anything since 2008, but I know who they are. And this came as a surprise, and I think it came as a surprise because it was mobilizing people that hadn't been voting. My expectation for how we'll get out of it, which I mentioned in my biography, is those people tend to be older. So I think time might take care of that. But the resurgence of Christian nationalism at all was a surprise, and it's definitely still here in this election.
Yeah, that's interesting. Go ahead, Amy.
I think I would just add, really appreciate what both of you have contributed, but I'm thinking about how many of us who might identify as progressive Christians have been drawn to say, well, among Lutherans, say the Heidelberg Disputations, the idea of calling a thing what it is. And I think in doing that, in trying to cultivate a prophetic voice that counters evangelical Christian nationalism, sometimes we just land only there.
Mm.
So that focus on just trying to speak the right way. So it's interesting to kind of connect that or relate that to the idea of managed discourse. We want to manage discourse on one hand. On the other hand, we have all these platforms for, sort of describing slogans and memes, including ones that tie to our faith convictions. And so it's like the prophetic tradition and calling the thing what it is sort of necessary but insufficient. What else can we do that isn't just sort of countering Christian nationalism with another rhetoric, but not necessarily, well, not always being heard. That's a whole other question too, right?
Yeah.
I'd like to also add that what you're talking about, Adam, in terms of the phenomenon of Christian nationalism, which we heard about in America, is there. I'd like to sort of point out that there's a global context to our discussion, to our discussion about the election as well. I recently heard a lecture by a sociologist of religion from Finland, Professor Titus Hjelm, who talks about Christian nationalism in the country of Finland. So
Right.
I think we're dealing with a global phenomenon that has its particularities or concretions in a particular nation with the particular inheritances of that nation, but there are analogous movements in different parts of the world.
Right, absolutely. So you could easily see like that in Hungary, and I think there's elements of it in Poland and in kind of some of those places in there. Yeah.
Right, and probably the thing that channels it a whole lot in the United States, and it's a little bit different, say, in your parliamentary democracies, where you just need a certain percentage to get into the parliament of the national vote, which Israel fits into that category, and some others. Or like France, where you have the National Front. A party like that can't exist in the United States because our electoral rules are such that creates two big parties.
Right.
That's because we have geographic bound voting territory, and you either win them or lose them. So for the presidency, it's the states. You either win Pennsylvania or lose Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is very important right now.
Right.
But because you have to win or lose in these units, we have two big parties. So then when we have, say, a particularist movement, say a nativist movement, it generally has to be absorbed by one of the big parties, and then party leaders have to deal with it. Where in France, you can have a number of parties, and National Front can concentrate that the group that thinks that way.
Yeah, I think that's been kind of the history of third party movements, has always been that they shoot out, they get a voice, and then one of the parties will consume them and make whatever kind of changes. That kind of brings up though the idea of how political parties have changed over the years.
Right.
Because they used to be very strong, and they would have really kind of the say is in determining who the candidates would be. They would be able to kind of push out the more extreme ends of the ideological spectrums, because they would be concerned with, well, we have to win, and so the extremists are not the ones who are going to win in a general election, and with in some senses, we've kind of done this to ourselves with making things. We kind of have limited the power of the parties in and the whole, a little more direct democracy in the selection of the political party process. And what has happened is you have these folks who are a little more extreme, and if they're in a multi-candidate election within a party, they only need that percentage to win that nomination, and then you're stuck with those candidates. That's been really interesting. To me, when I think about this question, I think there's a lot of people, and I'm not talking about like the hardcore partisans or the people who do politics and whatnot. I think the average person is just lost. I think it's like a tsunami of stuff that is hitting them. They don't know what to do about it. There's some messages that, may appeal to them and whatnot, but I don't know that they have the language to really describe, which to me again goes to the fact that, we have, as a nation, we have not done a good job of teaching people how to talk about religion and politics in healthy ways. We're, just avoid this because it's divisive and all this. Well, yeah, but it's also important, and it doesn't mean you have to like go. This is the dichotomy of the United States, right? It's all or nothing type of things, or there's just choice A and B, and that's it. Which drives me crazy, especially having lived in a foreign country in Finland, and then looking back and seeing like, no, it's not just two options. There's other things. That's a thing that is out there. So here's a question one of you had responded back to me with, which was, what do you make about the division of Christianity over politics and partisanship? What's your thought about that?
Yeah, I think there are the kind of political constraints of the American political system, which is the binary system of political governance, which as you mentioned, Adam, in this age of pluralism, we have moved away from a binary system of truth by recognizing difference in much more diversity than that which is constrained by the binary system. And I think that we have these exigencies of the binary system, but we have our vocations as theologians, as educators, as leaders, to change a culture towards the recognition of diversity, which means the recognition of difference, which means the recognition of disagreement in ways that are going to be different from the constraints that are imposed by our political system. So in one sense, we do have a challenge and an opportunity to think about how to go about the task of educating, of shifting a culture that on the one hand is constrained by a binary, but on the other hand is open to pluralism, where different people with their different personal stories and their different allegiances are going to be welcome into this sort of multifaceted conversation. So in one sense, we're as educators, we're working sort of counter the political constraints and saying the reality that we're engaging in and that we recognize is one that is not based on a binary, but is based on kind of plural recognitions of difference.
Yeah.
And one way for me to speak to sort of polarization now is, say we had Christian nationalists in the United States in 1973 when I was born. It wasn't clear which political party was theirs. And so you have this kind of distribution. Now, if you're a Christian nationalist, you'll be in the Republican Party. But that doesn't mean the Republican Party is by any means a monolith. It's just an internal party dilemma that they have. And so now what to do about that, that's a thing for me. So I'm a Democrat. So I'm not in that party. So I don't know what to do about that. There's no one within the Republican Party that's going to ask me, what should we do about this dilemma? Although I can tell you, I was in a prayer book. So I'm in an Episcopal church. We have a prayer book. And we had a conversation in my class, which was over Zoom. And it's now that you do things, classes over Zoom, time zones matter. So we had a lot of people from the Virgin Islands in my class.
Wow.
But our teacher is from the American South. And so the teacher brought up whether you should have a flag or not in church. Now, I knew that I wasn't worried if I had a flag or not in church, because I was actually in my living room taking the class, and I'm the leader, head pastor of the church, and I didn't know if we had one in there, which means that, and I couldn't go and look. So that means it's not salient. And also, I think from my perspective, it just shows where you are. The teacher who was at Virginia Theological Seminary was very concerned about and then the people in the Virgin Islands really like to have their flag in their church, because when you're a very small nation, you want to, there's a certain identity that comes from that.
Yeah, sure.
So it was a great conversation we all had, but I don't know why I started on this though. So sorry.
That's
sorry
okay, Adam. No worries.
I think I actually posed a couple questions to my adult ed class this morning. Got a break from looking at Gospel of John, and I noticed kind of two patterns. And this is I'm in a I guess you could say a purple town. There's two members of the county board. One's Republican, one's Democrat, in the adult ed class. Um, and a couple themes that I heard. One was there are some people who are really hungry for real conversations and just welcome. Maybe they'll start listening to Impolite Company more regularly,
There you go.
But I think looking for safe spaces, there's such a fear. There's fear. That's the number one thing
Yeah.
that I hear is fear of what will happen, fear of violence.
Yeah.
So seeking real places for that conversation. And on the other direction, the folks who don't want to have religion in politics, perhaps, but also just in the moment, this is my term for what some were saying. They want to practice a kind of asceticism, of de-escalation. So kind of redirecting away from following the news and the social media all the time, especially as we wait. Nobody thinks we're going to know the election results on Tuesday, right?
Sure.
So trying to avoid these sources that amplify every slight and every outrage, and focus on things like gardening or things that they know bring life. And for some, we talked about how there's temperamental differences, right? So part of what I think we navigate, those of us who want to foster more theological literacy about engaging and thinking about politics, is, well, some people want to do that and some don't.
Yeah, right.
And then those who've really fostered it, right, they're on the Christian right, we need to have more folks willing to cultivate that the other points of view. But I think also this de-escalation thing that we're all talking about, how we talk with one another, seems really important. And I think the last thing I'd say that kind of came out across these, and they kind of reminded me also of a conversation I had in 1990 when I was working on for the Chicago Religious Leadership Network in Central America. So I'll start there. Grace Jerry, who'd worked in Guatemala, Presbyterian missionary down there, she called me and said, I was like 23 years old, right? And she wanted to talk about the Guatemalan elections in Rios Montt, and she wanted to know what I saw as the future. I was like, well, what are you asking me, right? But she was the one who had far more experience. But what I was so impressed by with her and with so many of the faith-based activists, many of them middle-aged women, who were working on addressing human rights violations in Guatemala and El Salvador then, is that they always had this vision of the election isn't everything. This particular election in Nicaragua and El Salvador, they're not going to put their whole weight on that. There's a larger vision. And that's what I took away from my conversation with folks at my church this morning, a long haul vision.
Yeah.
That some things, like you said, Adam, will take generations for shifts, because some of them were saying, what the leaders at the top say really matters a lot, and there's not a lot somebody else can do about that. But this sort of whole, and I think that's what we foster in worship, right? This kind of larger vision of justice, of new creation. And so we think in relationship to that, but we don't put all of our weight into how some particular event turns out in a given day.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I'm glad you brought that up, Amy. You know, I have this theory, which is that when the Cold War ended, the early 90s, right, 91-ish, is that we were left as the sole superpower, supposedly, right? And prior to that, we had always been asking the question who we are based on who we're not. Well, we're not the Soviets. We know that much, right? You always got to have an enemy. And that's how we were defining ourselves. And then all of a sudden, the enemy is gone. And we've been asking that question, I think, under the surface without actually dealing with it since that point. So this is what, 3 decades in? And it feels like this is the election that we're actually asking well, who are we? We've been toying with it for 3 decades. And I have this theory that I don't think we're going to have an answer for that for at least another 20 years. Of really kind of defining who are we, if we ever actually have an answer, because we don't have this history of defining who we are based on who we are, as opposed to who we're not in that. But Amy, you set up the next question perfectly. Gold star to you. Is how do we go forward after this election? and I got a couple of sub questions with this. And I don't expect you all to have all of the answers on this, so don't worry about that. No pressure on this. But what are the challenges that the church needs to address? And is the church equipped to do it?
And you're talking about the church in the public sphere?
Yeah, talk about like the institutional church. And I know, again, that's a really broad way of putting it, right? And maybe at the congregational level, I kind of opening this question up to how do we go forward? And I don't pretend to think that like our national churches are gonna be able to have the answers because they don't have oftentimes the direct relationships with people. So it really is on the more of the congregational, possibly the synod or diocesan level. But again, there's a little bit of there's separation that happens. And oftentimes I think we're all aware of like, oh, well, the synod or the diocese did this in 19, whatever, and we're still upset. It's not the same people or anything, but what do you think? How do we go forward, with this?
Well, I think what Amy was talking about is pointing towards this sort of long-term cultural shift in moving away from an us versus them mentality. As you were saying, a lot of the sort of conversational practices, even leading up to this election, are by negating the other in order to affirm one's position. And I think that with a more pluralist understanding of society and a pluralist understanding of recognition, we have to practice different conversational techniques in order, as you said, Matthew, to identify one's own position without sort of a knee-jerk denying somebody else or polemicizing or dehumanizing someone else's position. And I want to kind of frame that attitude, that shift in attitude, with reference to one of the most gnarly, amazing texts that I know, which is Luther's Freedom of a Christian from 1520. And I think that text still deserves reading and studying because it explains how the Christian can be free from even holding on to one's position with a kind of a white knuckling of that position to the detriment of recognizing anyone else's positions. And so the freedom of a Christian can also be the freedom to let go, as Amy, as you were talking about, that the entire election doesn't depend on winning or losing or me having my position, which means somebody else is not going to have theirs. But it's a relative freedom from hanging on to one's position in such a way that one would deny the legitimacy and the value of someone else.
Christine's answer sparked an idea of mine, which is one thing that churches can do, especially for helping engage dialogue, is because we do lots of education within our churches. And so this past spring, we had a deacon who was working on having a more common sense gun control. And she held a forum, and we were definitely of multiple opinions, and we were able to actually negotiate all that, and a lot of good things came from it. Then these two sociologists wrote a book called The Great De-Churching.
Okay.
And it was so it's Jim Davis and Michael Graham. Sorry, I had to grab it here just for
visual. That's fine.
But the thing they note is that people that have really crystallized religious opinions tend not to be engaged in a religious institution discussing religious thought all that much. They tend to have left religious institutions and sit at home and have very solid opinions with themselves. And so that's a dilemma of the shrinking church, because we definitely have shrunk since 1968, which means there's less opportunity for people to engage in discussions about religious truth and how that affects the public sphere. But I know that that forum that we had about gun control was contentious, but really worthwhile. There were a lot of good things that came out of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And I did something like that with others in the community about a month ago. We held a conversation, diverse Christian perspectives about abortion. And it was when I had used the ELCA's Faith and Civic Life study guide series a year ago, and members of 6 different churches came to that. It's a very good set of, I'd highly recommend using study guides like that to get folks thinking about all these sorts of questions about faith and politics. But out of that, the woman who's the head of the League of Women Voters said, well, let's do something ecumenically that is about a specific topic. And how about abortion? And by the time it all kind of could work out, it was early October. It was with the other person, and I would represent a kind of progressive Christian perspectives. And then the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastor actually agreed to do the conservative. And of course, we were kind of trying to complicate those binaries between pro-choice and life and so on. But in any case, we're going to have it at my church, but my church council was very afraid of that. Afraid before the election, afraid, and also I don't think because they hadn't been actually part of the discussion, so there was some misunderstanding. But eventually we had it at the Lutheran Student Center that was run by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and there were 50 people who came.
Wow.
And the setup wasn't one in which we could kind of do the sort of small tables discussions, but some of us did stay afterwards. The conversation was robust. There were definitely strong opinions expressed. And probably more of the people who felt this is a theme I see in where I live, in my context. I would say the people who are conservative on an issue like an abortion feel much more comfortable taking up airspace. Those who are supportive of abortion rights. I think because of Roe v. Wade, Christians haven't had to practice thinking about the moral complexities of reproductive justice. And so I felt like that, that was a good thing to try to do. But also the theme I'm picking up in is it can't be imposed upon people, those difficult conversations. There have to be spaces where folks who are hungry for them can have them. And I think ecumenical spaces is really helpful because at any given church, there might be folks who really resist either participating or even having their church hosting them.
Yep.
So these are all contextually, situated.
Yeah, what I hear through all of your answers is really this idea of this human contact, of humanizing issues, right? I've talked about this before, in the sense that I think where we have problems with conversations about religion and politics is when those remain issues in the abstract. And so people then, they feel like they can fight about an abstract issue, as opposed to now if I'm sitting across the table from someone and we're going to talk about abortion or poverty or gun control or whatever, that this can actually have an impact on the person I'm talking to or on myself and we can see it in each other. Now all of a sudden it's no longer just an issue. Now it's a person with a name. And we start to see the complexity that it's not just nice and easy to come and pick a side and, and then just have our tweets and our bumper stickers and whatever else they are. Now it's messy and there aren't nice, easy answers and all this type of stuff. And I think this kind of goes to somebody else was talking about this with, there's no hard, fast go-to type of things in this. And I think this is where the church is not going to be perfect in this. But again, I really appreciate what you were just saying, Amy, about the idea of invitational. If the church isn't anything, it should be invitational, right? And never kind of like, oh, you're gonna participate in this whether you like it or not, or okay. People aren't going to be happy. They're not gonna go in with the right type of thing, and it's just not helpful to folks to force them into conversation. Some people are just not ready. Some people just don't have the capacity at any given time, right? Because it's stressful. It's extremely stressful, and sometimes it's too much for people to be able to handle. Especially if people are just trying to survive in that. So, yeah, I appreciate all of those answers.
I want to jump in on the what Amy and you, Matthew, were talking about in terms of theology offering a different space for a conversation that is multi-layered, complex, and sort of one in which persons mutually recognize each other's humanities. I mean, usually so people look at theology as a sort of a critical wedge against society. We have theologians who have are able to diagnose what's wrong with society based on the critical tools that theology offers. And I think sometimes that has gone to extremes, but I think one important critical tool that theology can offer against our society is to be critical of the kinds of speech that are directed through social media. I think I look at Luther's Reformation as one of a reformation of language in an age of linguistic corruption. So where words are sort of directed into cyberspace, words are directed, and they have come to accrue all sorts of predicates, all sorts of meanings that sometimes are in opposition to each other or contradictory. And so how do we begin to use language in ways that are clear, that have a more are referring to the truth about something, and that is through interpersonal, intersubjective conversation. The church is such a space, or the academy, seminars, lectures are such a space where people are brought together in order to see each other face to face, and that contains an ethical obligation that we don't have in social media or even evaluations on Amazon, or even teaching evaluations. These are all anonymous, and the ethical obligation to humanize the other whom you are evaluating is dropped off. And so I think spaces in which intersubjectivity, face-to-face conversations, real people engaging real other real people is an opportunity to begin changing the culture about conversation, and sort of correcting that linguistic corruption that is sort of the social stew in which we're swimming.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that was actually going in the direction of the next question, which was dealing with social media and that kind of impersonal nature of it. Right? It's kind of like driving in a car. There are people who are going to do things that are not polite because there's a sense of anonymity in it, right? I watched a short. It was a comedic video of these two news reporters, and they were interviewing someone who is a safe driving expert, supposedly for a newscast, right? And so they were like, "Hey, it's great to have you here. What can you tell us?" And he said, "Well, what's really interesting is that if you take like 10 years and you go back and you remember the guy who flicked you off on the road, and then you become a safe driving expert in order to get onto his show and remind him that, I actually changed the brownies that were here. And how many did you eat, Doug?" Like, wow, this guy went through this whole thing to just get back at somebody. And I don't think it's controversial to say that social media is just oftentimes not healthy. It's like a Wild West type of situation that, of course, we're only scratching the surface on this, because we're not even talking about manipulation by outside sources that are trying to drive a narrative or create misinformation or create distrust, especially if you're talking about like a foreign power, that if you're going to want to see your opponents, your enemies kind of fall apart, what better way to do that than to sow distrust among the population within itself? Thoughts on, what the church and social media, the church and these kind of anonymous, or the issue of anonymity, or this kind of protection of, it's not me, it's, I'm putting this out there, that type of thing. Thoughts on going forward. What can we as a church do with trying to help folks with these type of platforms? We're not going to be able to change these platforms, but the people using them, hopefully we can have some influence on and try to create a change that way.
Well, I love the motto of Impolite Company, which has to do with humanizing humanity, and anything that any sermon, any lecture that can point out ways of humanizing the other, I think is really crucial. I also want to point out that the even though the social media is anonymous, the biases, the prejudices that we have about race, gender, and class are always intensified
Right.
along social media. I think humanizing the other, bringing different issues to the fore, for example, the death penalty. Yesterday, South Carolina executed Richard Moore, even though the judge and the jurors were all against his execution. And I think we need to change the way we speak about others, about migrants, rather than the discourse of dehumanizing, the discourse of humanizing, so that these prejudices, will at least people will become aware of the kinds of distinctions, binaries that they put out there.
I guess I would think maybe this is just because this is what I try to do, but some balance between participation and fasting or asceticism, I think, and we all have different balances in that regard. I mean, sometimes I've thought like Facebook, and now there's many others, as like the neighborhood back porch. So you're going to say something that lots of folks might hear. You can have some more intimate conversations, but they're going to be overheard by many people. But another thing I think about is kind of recognizing this isn't, I mean, none of this is completely new. We just have different forms for it. These avenues we have for name calling, and for creating these sort of memes that are supposed to sort of crystallize people's feelings or why we should oppose something. I mean, think of all the verses in the Bible or in Luther's writings that would be great tweets or little comments, right? Why don't you just go all the way and circumcise yourself? I mean, just think of all those things that you could put up there. So I think owning that this is something we can all do. And I think the other thing that I've found the few times I've tried to participate is you can try to have a humanizing conversation. You can try to pull things out. You can try to invite somebody to explain more. But there are going to be people who just want to shut it. Right. Just want to come back to their talking point. So, yeah. Participation, but fasting too.
Yeah.
So the first town I lived in was Elkins, West Virginia, which is an Appalachian college town, 5,000 people. And it was very fun, but you had lots of potential for lunacy just in conversations with people. And as we're all academics or clergy or both here, and I like social media a lot because I have a diverse social network that is geographically spread out. And so it turns out once these things developed, I was teaching at University of Wisconsin-Madison when I first noticed it, and it was organized by class. Class section, like the section that meets at 9 a.m. on Wednesday, not social class, but like my 9 o'clock section on political theory. And I thought, oh, this is a great way for me to learn that 19-year-old white boy who wears a hat and doesn't talk. So I'll just learn his name at this point. And turns out that was wrong because he would have a picture of like Homer Simpson rather than himself. But ever since that time, and I was just, I took a month and did immersion French. And the people in my class were in Montreal were mostly immigrants, aged 19 to 51 with me. And when we got to it, you could tell our curriculum was old because one of the questions was, do you like Facebook or Instagram? And the 19-year-old from Lebanon, or no, she's from Jordan. She's like, I don't use those. And I'm like, I'm just going to say it so she can. And I said, Facebook is for the old. And she's like, yes, it is. Like, I'll just be the one to bring that up. Yep. But it's a great tool for keeping track of a wide social network. And then the critical thinking tools where it becomes a danger is that knowing your information source and knowing how credible it is all the more important now. And one of the dilemmas is I have a pretty good idea of how to judge the thoroughness of a journalistic source. With decentralization of education, that's becoming tougher. I think if there was any witness the church had, would be, or at least probably a stronger voice for having straight up public schools. because school vouchers and homeschooling have led to a denigration of the critical thinking skills that are necessary for evaluating information sources, and that is a big danger. I have a different book to plug. I can't believe I'm plugging two books, but one of my friends from grad school, who's a devout Episcopalian named Josh Cowan, wrote a book called The Privateers, and it's about how billionaires used vouchers to create lots of little schools that they don't have to pay for, that give a very, very narrow form of education, which is not helpful at all for society.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Amy,
maybe,
did you want to plug our book?
yeah, please do.
Yeah, you should.
Oh, I don't have a copy here in this
no.
room.
Oh, I do. I have a copy of our
Perfect.
book right here.
That's right.
Ordinary Faith in Polarized Times, the subtitle Justification and the Pursuit of Justice. So this doesn't directly address the social media question, but I think, where we can, as the church, identify what's the core, what does it mean to belong to the Christian church? So that's kind of the core thesis of our book. It's about our baptismal belonging first and foremost, and then we're drawn to seek justice. So justification by faith, in Paul's words, we're drawn then to seek justice. We don't all agree on how to do that, but we don't want to condition Christian belonging the way those who would say that, to be Christian, the Christian versus secular dichotomy, right? So pushing back against the idea that Christian identity means something, a particular political perspective, but yet we must be engaged, right? So sorry,
and
God.
Go ahead. And that theology is a critical tool for thinking. One of the advantages of theology over thousands of years has been the educative, pedagogical task of theology. Theology is an exercise, is a discipline in thinking about God and thinking in a critical and creative way about self, world, and God. And in our book, and also in my own vocation as a theologian, I really market theology as a way of rigorous thinking that uses logic, that uses philosophy, that uses our different tools of argument in order to make claims. It's not theology as telling you what to believe or what to think, but theology is freeing persons to think for themselves about critical issues.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I highly recommend the book. By the way, I for those who are listening, I also did a podcast interviewing Amy and Christine about the book for the Journal of Lutheran Ethics, and so I recommend people can check that out when that comes out. So we got just a couple of minutes left. It's been a quick hour, so this is like the lightning round. So. Here's my question for you is very, very quickly, what's your hope for after Tuesday? What's your hope for the conversation? Go past like, oh, I want it to be healthy, right? Realistic, where we are. Hope is not, the just nice pie in the sky. Hope is recognizing where things are and saying there's a better way that God is leading us to, right? So what's your hope for post-election when it comes to the church and discussion around faith and politics? And if each of you want to take just like 15 seconds.
So what I don't want is what fundamentalist entrepreneurs did in the 70s, which is they pick three issues and say the church is about three issues, 1, 2, 3, and they have theirs. I'd love for church to be a place where people can grow in their faith and from time to time deal with specific issues of the day, but not act as if church is about that specific issue of the day, but learning how to deal with that. That's
great. I can get on board with that. Christine?
Yeah, I just finished a lecture on Luther directed hope in the resurrection, and so I'm not going to quote Luther to answer your question. I do hope that that people begin to see each other as human beings and begin to explore ways how to engage in listening and in conversation. And I also hope that people will begin to examine themselves, their own griefs or grievances or their own feelings and experiences, why they hold on to certain positions the way they do.
Right. And Amy?
stay grounded in worship and liturgy. Cultivate those kinds of connections that are beyond politics so that we can engage it more effectively.
Well said. Wonderful. Well, thank you, all three of you. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate all of you being willing to do this. I think we've just kind of hopefully embodied exactly what we've been talking about. And so with that, thank you again. I appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and stay faithful in the midst of a world that's full of a lot of despair, anger, and fear. You're not alone, and God loves you. All right, with that, I'm signing off. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Oh.